Have you ever heard of a bond so strong that not even time, distance, or death could break it? Imagine living alone, with no one to trust, until one stormy night, you find a wounded horse, barely clinging to life. You save it, care for it, and over time, it becomes your loyal protector. But what happens when fate puts this friendship to the ultimate test? Today, you'll discover an incredible story of loyalty, love, and an unbreakable connection that became a legend. If you love inspiring stories, hit the like button and subscribe for more. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Now let's dive in. The late afternoon sky over Willow Creek, Texas, had turned an ominous shade of charcoal. Storm clouds gathered above the sprawling Hope Ranch, bringing with them the scent of rain and electricity. The ranch hands worked frantically to secure equipment and guide the horses into their stables before the deluge began. Storm, a 17-hand Frisian stallion with a coat as black as midnight, paced nervously in his paddock. His muscular frame tensed with each rumble of thunder, his intelligent eyes tracking the movements across the ranch. Unlike the other horses who seemed merely agitated, Storm appeared vigilant, almost protective. Mark Johnson, the head wrangler, wiped sweat from his brow as he approached the paddock. "Easy there, big fella. We'll get you inside soon enough." The first fat raindrops began to fall as a panicked neigh cut through the air. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene. Daisy, a young mare, had bolted from her handler and was galloping toward the eastern pasture where the ground dropped steeply toward the creek, now swelling with rainwater. "Daisy's loose," someone shouted. "She's heading for the ravine." Before anyone could react, Storm reared up and cleared the 4-foot fence of his paddock in a single, powerful leap. The massive black horse thundered across the muddy ground, closing the distance to the panicked mare with astonishing speed. "What in God's name?" Mark started, then broke into a run, knowing he could never catch them. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the ground treacherous. Storm caught up to Daisy just as she neared the edge of the ravine, positioning his body to cut off her path. The mare skidded to a halt, but the momentum carried both horses toward the edge. In a desperate maneuver, Storm pushed against Daisy, turning her away from danger. The ground beneath Storm's hooves gave way. Mark watched in horror as the magnificent stallion scrambled for purchase on the slick earth before tumbling down the embankment, his powerful body striking rocks and tree roots on the way down. "Get Dr. Winters on the phone now," Mark bellowed, already sliding down the muddy slope toward where Storm lay motionless at the bottom, the rain washing rivulets of red from his hindquarters into the churning water. 3 hours later, in the ranch's medical barn, Dr. Sarah Winters removed her gloves with a grim expression. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Storm's sedated form. X-rays displayed on the lightbox showed the devastating damage to his spine and hind legs. "There's severe trauma to the lumbar vertebrae and significant nerve damage," she explained to Jessica Hayes, the ranch owner. "His front legs are fine, but he'll never use his hind legs again. He can't stand, can't walk, can't be a horse anymore." Jessica's eyes welled with tears. "Are you certain? There must be something. I've consulted with specialists at Texas A&M. Everyone agrees." Dr. Winters placed a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder. "The kindest thing would be to put him down. He's in pain, and there's no quality of life for a horse that can't stand." "But he saved Daisy," Jessica whispered, reaching out to stroke Storm's muzzle. "He sacrificed himself. That's why we owe him a dignified end," Dr. Winters said softly. "I can do it tomorrow morning. Give everyone a chance to say goodbye." Neither woman noticed the elderly man in the wheelchair who had paused outside the barn door, listening intently, his weathered face hardening with resolve as he turned and wheeled himself back toward the main house through the now gentle rain. Hope Ranch sat on the outskirts of Willow Creek like a small, self-contained world. What had begun as a horse rescue operation 15 years ago had gradually expanded to include a unique eldercare facility. The sprawling property now featured not only state-of-the-art equine rehabilitation stables, but also a collection of cozy cottages where elderly residents lived semi-independently, many of them former ranchers, farmers, or horse enthusiasts with nowhere else to go. Henry Carter occupied the smallest cottage at the edge of the property. At 78, his 6-foot frame had begun to stoop, but his shoulders remained broad, hinting at the strength he once possessed. Deep lines etched his weathered face, and his steel-gray hair was still thick despite his age. The stroke 18 months ago had left the right side of his body weakened and his speech occasionally halting, but his piercing blue eyes retained their intensity and determination. Henry's cottage was sparse but functional, decorated with faded photographs of horses he'd trained and ribbons from competitions long past. A bookshelf overflowed with veterinary journals and equine therapy texts, many dog-eared from years of reference. The morning after the storm, Henry wheeled himself to the dining hall for breakfast, his movements practiced and efficient despite his disability. The communal space buzzed with conversation, most of it centered on Storm's accident. "Poor creature," said Mabel Williams, an 80-year-old former schoolteacher, shaking her head as she stirred her oatmeal. "Jessica's doing the right thing, though. No sense in prolonging suffering." "When are they putting him down?" asked George Nelson, a retired cattle rancher whose arthritic hands curled permanently around his coffee mug. "This afternoon, I heard," replied Mabel. "Dr. Winters wanted to give him one more night, see if there was any change, but apparently there's no hope." Henry remained silent, methodically cutting his scrambled eggs with the edge of his fork, his left hand compensating for the weakness in his right. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After breakfast, he wheeled himself to the administrative building where Jessica kept her office. He knocked once, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wooden door. "Come in," called Jessica, looking up from her computer with surprise when Henry entered. "Henry, good morning. What can I do for you?" "The Black Horse," Henry said, his words deliberate, fighting against the slight slur that manifested when he was emotional. "Storm, I want to see him." Jessica's expression softened with sympathy. "Oh, Henry, I know you were once a physical therapist for horses, but I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. We've consulted multiple specialists." "Not asking to treat him," Henry replied, his voice growing stronger with determination. "Just to see him." "Before." Jessica hesitated. "It might be upsetting for you. The damage is extensive." Henry's eyes flashed. "I've seen worse. Much worse. During my time at Kentucky Derby Circuit." "All right," Jessica conceded. "Mark can take you to the medical barn after lunch." "But Henry," she added gently, "please understand that the decision is made. It's the humane choice." Henry nodded curtly and wheeled himself out without another word. Instead of returning to his cottage, he made his way to the small library in the main building. For the next 3 hours, he pulled book after book from the shelves, making notes in a tattered spiral notebook balanced on his knee. When Donna, one of the caregivers, found him to remind him about lunch, she noticed the titles spread across the table: Equine Spinal Injuries, Neurological Recovery in Large Mammals, Hydrotherapy for Rehabilitation. "Henry," she said carefully, "what are you doing?" The old man looked up, a spark in his eyes that she hadn't seen since before his stroke. "Research," he replied simply. "For Storm? But you know they're wrong." Henry interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "That horse saved another. Now someone needs to save him." "But the veterinarians," Henry scoffed, tapping his temple with one finger. "They know medicine. I know determination. I know what it's like when everyone says you're finished." He gestured to his wheelchair. "They said I'd never leave hospital bed. They were wrong." Donna sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of his jaw. "Don't get your hopes up, Henry. And don't make things harder for Jessica. She's heartbroken about Storm already." Henry closed his notebook and tucked it into the side pocket of his wheelchair. "Not about hope," he said. "About refusing to give up before you've tried everything." He began gathering his books. "I've outlived 3 doctors who said I had 6 months to live. Sometimes, Donna, the experts are wrong." The medical barn was quiet when Mark escorted Henry inside that afternoon. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting golden rectangles on the clean concrete floor. The air smelled of antiseptic and fresh hay, a strange but not unpleasant combination. Storm lay on his side in a large stall padded with extra bedding, and 4 drip provided fluids and pain medication. Despite his sedation, the horse's ears twitched at the sound of Henry's wheelchair approaching. His great dark eye opened, regarding the visitors with what Henry could only describe as dignified resignation. "He's been like this since they brought him in," Mark explained softly. "Dr. Winters says there's complete paralysis from mid-back down. No deep pain response in the hind legs at all." Henry nodded slowly, taking in the magnificent animal before him. Even injured and immobile, Storm radiated a powerful presence. "Leave me with him," Henry requested. "Just for a while." Mark hesitated. "Dr. Winters will be here in an hour." "I shouldn't. Please," Henry said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I want to say goodbye properly." Something in the old man's expression made Mark relent. "All right. I'll be in the tack room if you need anything. Just holler." When Mark's footsteps faded, Henry wheeled himself closer to Storm's head. The horse's breathing was steady, his coat still glossy despite his condition. Henry reached out a weathered hand, letting Storm catch his scent before gently touching the animal's forehead. "So they've given up on you too, have they?" Henry murmured. "Decided you're too broken to fix. Not worth the trouble." He stroked the horse's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the skin. "I know something about that." Storm blinked, seeming to focus more intently on Henry's face. "I trained horses for 30 years, Henry continued, his voice gaining strength. "Then I rehabilitated them for 20 more. Saw injuries they said were career-ending, life-ending." He leaned closer. "Not all of them made it back. But some did. The ones with heart. The ones who fought." Henry reached for Storm's foreleg, running his hands along the tendons and muscles with practiced expertise. The horse didn't flinch or pull away, allowing the examination. "You have heart," Henry said decisively. "I can see it in your eyes. Same look I saw in Olympic jumpers, in Derby winners." He moved his wheelchair around to examine as much of Storm as he could without disturbing him. "You're not ready to quit. Neither am I." The door to the medical barn swung open, and Jessica entered with Dr. Winters. The veterinarian carried a case that Henry knew contained the euthanasia drugs. "Henry," Jessica said gently, "it's time. Mark should have come to get you." Henry wheeled around to face them, positioning himself between the women and Storm. "No," he said firmly. Dr. Winters exchanged a confused glance with Jessica. "I understand this is difficult," she began, "but we've discussed." "You discussed," Henry interrupted. "You decided. Without trying everything." "Henry," Jessica sighed, "I know your background, and I respect it. But we've consulted with specialists. The damage is irreparable." "Specialists," Henry scoffed. "They said same thing about me after stroke. Said I'd never speak clearly again, never use right arm." He deliberately lifted his right arm, making a fist despite the obvious effort it took. "They were wrong." Dr. Winters set her case down, her expression compassionate but firm. "Human medicine and veterinary medicine are different fields, Mr. Carter. And the economics of keeping a horse that can never stand again." "Economics?" Henry's voice rose. "This ranch was built on second chances. Says so in your mission statement." He pointed to the plaque on the wall. "Hope Ranch, where second chances begin." "Or is that just for show?" Jessica flinched as if he'd struck her. "That's not fair, Henry. What's not fair is giving up before you've tried everything." Henry pulled his notebook from his pocket. "I've been researching. Water therapy, custom harnesses, progressive muscle stimulation." He flipped open the book, revealing pages of notes and diagrams. "It can work. Has worked. For horses with similar injuries." "Those were different cases," Dr. Winters argued. "I've seen Storm's x-rays. The vertebral damage." "Give me 3 months," Henry interrupted. 3 months to try? If he shows no improvement, I won't fight you." Jessica shook her head. "Henry, we can't let him suffer for 3 months while you attempt experimental therapies." 1 month, then," Henry countered, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "And I'm not talking experimental. I'm talking about adapted techniques. Ones I've used before." Dr. Winters reached for her case again. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. The decision is made." Henry's face hardened. He wheeled his chair more firmly in front of Storm, blocking their path. "If you do this," he said, his voice low and intense, "you're killing more than this horse. You're killing everything this place stands for." The barn door opened again, and Rachel Carter stepped inside. At 34, she shared her uncle's determined blue eyes and tall frame, though her chestnut hair contrasted with his gray. She took in the scene quickly, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" she asked, moving to stand beside Henry's wheelchair. "They're about to put down a horse that could be saved," Henry said before anyone else could speak. "Rachel," Jessica began, "I didn't know you were visiting today." "I came as soon as Uncle Henry called me," Rachel replied, resting a protective hand on her uncle's shoulder. "He told me about Storm's injury. I'd like to see the x-rays before any decisions are finalized." "Rachel," With all due respect, you're a human physical therapist, Dr. Winters said. A neurological rehabilitation specialist, Rachel corrected, who's worked with veterans with spinal cord injuries for the past decade, and who grew up learning equine therapy from her uncle. She gestured to the case in Dr. Winters' hand. Put that away for now. Let's talk possibilities instead of endings. The conference room in Hope Ranch's main building had never felt so tense. X-rays of Storm's spine were displayed on a light box mounted to the wall, the severe damage clearly visible even to untrained eyes. Rachel Carter stood beside them, pointing to specific vertebrae with a laser pointer, while Jessica, Dr. Winters, and two other ranch board members listened with varying degrees of skepticism. Henry sat in his wheelchair at the end of the table, his notebook open before him. The damage is concentrated here, at L1 and L2, Rachel explained, circling the affected area. Yes, there's compression of the spinal cord, but it doesn't appear to be completely severed. Dr. Winters leaned forward. Rachel, I appreciate your expertise in human rehabilitation, but equine spinal injuries are fundamentally different. Horses are obligate standers. They need to be on all four legs. I understand that, Rachel replied calmly. But we're not talking about returning Storm to competition jumping or even normal pasture life immediately. We're talking about incremental progress. Even if you could achieve some improvement, Jessica said, the resources required. I'll fund it, Henry interrupted. All eyes turned to him. My savings. All of it. Rachel smiled sadly. Uncle Henry, your medical expenses, Medicare covers most, he said dismissively. Been saving since I was 20. Never had children to spend it on. He tapped his notebook. This is more important. Jessica sighed. It's not just about money. It's about facilities, staff time, the potential for prolonged suffering if it doesn't work. Which is why we've developed this, Rachel said, pulling out a tablet and bringing up a detailed presentation. A comprehensive rehabilitation plan combining adapted human techniques with established equine therapy. For the next 40 minutes, Rachel methodically outlined their proposal. She showed diagrams of a custom water therapy system that could be installed in the ranch's pond, using a hydraulic lift and specially designed harness to allow Storm to experience weightlessness while rebuilding muscle memory. Water therapy reduces pressure on the spine while allowing for movement, she explained. We'd start with just getting him upright in the water, then progress to guided limb manipulation. And the muscle atrophy? Dr. Winters asked, her professional interest clearly piqued despite her skepticism. Henry spoke up, his voice stronger than it had been in months. Electrical stimulation. Used it on racehorses for years. Keeps muscles from wasting while they heal. Rachel nodded. Combined with manual therapy and progressive resistance exercises, we'd establish clear benchmarks and evaluation criteria at each stage. And if he shows no improvement after a certain period, asked Robert Williams, the ranch's financial director. Then we reassess, Rachel said quietly. We're not suggesting Storm should suffer indefinitely, but 3 months of dedicated effort before making an irreversible decision. Isn't that in line with Hope Ranch's mission? Jessica looked troubled. The protocol you're suggesting has never been attempted on a horse with this severe an injury. That doesn't mean it won't work, Henry countered. Just means nobody's been stubborn enough to try. Dr. Winters studied the rehabilitation plan displayed on Rachel's tablet. Some of these techniques, they're actually quite sound from a theoretical standpoint. The challenge would be implementation and preventing secondary complications, pressure sores, respiratory issues. All addressed in the comprehensive care plan, Rachel said, flipping to another slide that detailed daily maintenance procedures. I've already spoken with 2 vet tech students from Texas A&M who would volunteer time for clinical experience. Jessica looked at the other board members, then back at Henry and Rachel. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this, but I need to consider what's best for Storm and the ranch. I'll take a leave of absence, Rachel said suddenly. From my practice. 3 months. I'll oversee the program personally. Henry's head snapped up, surprise evident on his face. Rachel, your patience can be transferred temporarily, she finished. This is important, Uncle Henry. I know how much it means to you. She turned back to Jessica. And I believe it could pioneer new approaches to equine rehabilitation. Think of the possibilities for other injured animals. A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Robert Williams cleared his throat. From a financial perspective, if Mr. Carter is funding the equipment and Ms. Carter is donating her time, the additional costs to the ranch would be minimal, and the potential research benefits could attract grants down the line. Dr. Winters shook her head, but her expression had softened. It's unorthodox, and I want to be clear, the prognosis remains poor. But I can't deny there's sound science in parts of this approach. Jessica looked at Henry, taking in his determined expression and the tremor in his right hand that he couldn't quite control, a reminder of his own battle against medical expectations. Finally, she nodded slowly. 1 month, she said firmly. We'll try for 1 month. If there's no measurable improvement by then, we make the humane choice. And at the first sign that Storm is suffering unnecessarily, we stop immediately. Those are my conditions. Henry's weathered face broke into a rare, genuine smile. Fair enough, he agreed, extending his hand to shake on the deal. As they left the conference room, Rachel pulled her uncle aside. You know the odds are against us, she said quietly. Henry nodded, looking toward the medical barn where Storm lay. Odds were against me walking after stroke. Still managed 10 steps last month in therapy. He patted her hand. Sometimes, odds don't know what they're talking about. This is going to be the hardest rehabilitation either of us has ever attempted, Rachel warned. Henry's blue eyes sparkled with a determination that had been absent for too long. Good, he said simply. About time we had a challenge worth fighting for. Dawn broke over Hope Ranch with a palette of pinks and golds that seemed to promise possibility. Henry had barely slept, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. He was already dressed and in his wheelchair when Rachel knocked on his cottage door at 5:30 a.m. You're up early, she remarked, wheeling him down the path toward the medical barn. Couldn't sleep, Henry admitted. Kept thinking about the harness design. Need to adjust the chest strap to account for his barrel. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-dampened grass and distant hay fields. When they reached the medical barn, they found Dr. Winters already there, checking Storm's vital signs and changing his for. His blood work looks good, she reported cautiously. Pain levels seem manageable, and he's eating a little. Henry wheeled himself to Storm's side, running a practiced hand along the horse's neck. Good morning, fighter, he murmured, ready to prove them all wrong. Storm's ear flicked toward Henry's voice, his dark eye regarding the old man with what almost seemed like recognition. Over the next week, the rehabilitation area took shape. The ranch hands built a ramp leading into the small lake at the property's edge, while Rachel supervised the installation of an overhead pulley system anchored to sturdy posts driven deep into the lake bed. Henry spent hours sewing and adjusting a specialized harness, adapting a design he'd used decades earlier for horses recovering from tendon injuries. The buoyancy of the water will support approximately 60% of his body weight, Rachel explained to Jessica and Dr. Winters as they inspected the completed setup. That should be enough to allow some movement without putting dangerous pressure on his spine. And these? Dr. Winters asked, pointing to the small electrodes attached to the harness. Neuromuscular electrical stimulation, Henry replied, demonstrating the small control unit. Sends mild electrical impulses to the muscles, prevents atrophy, reminds the body how to contract even when the brain's signals aren't getting through. Dr. Winters nodded, clearly impressed despite her lingering skepticism. It's an ingenious adaptation of human technology. I'm just concerned about the stress of moving him to the lake. We've thought of that, Rachel said, pulling out diagrams of a specialized trailer with a hydraulic floor. We'll sedate him lightly, move him onto this platform while he's lying down, then gradually tilt it once we're at the water's edge. The transition should be smooth. The first attempt at water therapy came 10 days after Storm's accident. A small crowd had gathered, ranch hands, residents from the elder care facility, and even a few curious neighbors who had heard about the unorthodox treatment. Henry insisted on being as close as possible, his wheelchair positioned at the edge of the wooden platform built into the lake. Rachel stood waist-deep in the water, directing the team of 4 assistants who would help position Storm in the harness. The specialized trailer backed slowly to the edge of the ramp. Inside, Storm lay sedated but conscious, his breathing steady. The hydraulic platform began its gradual tilt, and the assistants guided the trailer backward until Storm's body was partially submerged. Easy now, Rachel called. Keep his head supported. Kevin, Make sure that neck strap is secure but not tight. The process of fitting the harness underwater was painstaking. Storm's eyes widened in alarm several times, but Henry's steady voice from the platform seemed to calm him. "You're doing fine, boy," he called. "Water feels good, doesn't it? Takes the weight off." Finally, the overhead pulley system was engaged, gradually lifting until Storm was suspended in the water, his body held in a natural position with his legs just touching the lake bottom. "Perfect," Rachel breathed, checking that the harness was supporting all the critical areas without putting pressure on his spine. "Now we wait. Let him get accustomed to the sensation." For nearly an hour, they simply maintained Storm's position in the water. Henry watched intently for any sign of distress, but the horse seemed, if anything, relieved to be partially upright again. "I'm going to try some passive movement now," Rachel announced. She gently took hold of Storm's right hind leg and began to move it through a natural walking motion. This reminds the muscles and nerves of their normal function. Even if he can't initiate movement yet, his body remembers. "Look at his expression," Mabel commented from where the elder care residents were watching. "He doesn't seem to be fighting it." "That's because it feels right," Henry said confidently. "His body knows what it's supposed to do, even if the connection is damaged." The first session lasted 90 minutes before Dr. Winters insisted they return Storm to the medical barn to rest. The process of extracting him was as complex as putting him in, but by mid-afternoon, he was back in his stall, exhausted but showing no signs of additional pain or stress. "What did you think?" Henry asked Dr. Winters as she completed her post-therapy examination. "I think it went as well as could be expected," she replied cautiously. "No additional trauma. Heart rate and respiration remained stable throughout." She hesitated. His muscle tone already seemed slightly improved from the electrical stimulation. "But, Henry, one good session doesn't mean—" "I know," he interrupted. "Long road ahead. But first step is taken." Over the next 2 weeks, the routine became established. Morning and evening sessions in the lake, with increasingly complex passive movement exercises. Between water therapies, Henry spent hours at Storm's side, massaging his muscles, talking to him constantly, and using the electrical stimulation units on specific muscle groups. "You need to rest too, Uncle Henry," Rachel admonished one evening, finding him still in the medical barn at nearly midnight. "I am resting," he insisted, though the fatigue lines around his eyes told a different story. "Just finishing his evening treatment." Rachel watched as Henry's gnarled hands moved methodically over Storm's hind leg, applying just the right pressure to stimulate circulation without causing discomfort. The horse's head was turned, watching Henry work with an attentiveness that seemed almost human. "He's responding to you," Rachel observed. "More than to any of us." Henry nodded. "We understand each other," he said simply. "Both been written off. Both too stubborn to accept it." 3 weeks into the treatment, during an early morning session in the lake, 7-year-old Emily Patterson clutched the railing of the platform in excitement. The little girl, whose parents worked at the ranch, had appointed herself Storm's unofficial cheerleader, showing up for every therapy session with unwavering optimism. "Mr. Henry," she called suddenly. His leg moved. All by itself, Henry squinted through the morning sunlight reflecting off the water. Rachel had just released Storm's right hind leg after a passive movement exercise, and there, almost imperceptible but definitely real, a small, voluntary twitch. "Did you see that?" Henry demanded, his voice tight with emotion. Rachel nodded slowly, her professional reserve cracking into a smile. "Voluntary movement," she confirmed. "Small, but definite." Emily was already running toward the main house, her blonde ponytail bouncing with each step. "Ms. Jessica," her voice carried back to them. "Come quick." Storm moved his leg. "He's getting better." Henry reached out from his wheelchair, his fingers just reaching Storm's muzzle where it rose above the water. "Good boy," he whispered, his weathered cheeks damp with tears that had nothing to do with the water splashing from the lake. "I knew you had fight in you." Word of Storm's first voluntary movement spread through Hope Ranch like wildfire. By lunchtime, the small twitch had grown to mythic proportions in the retelling, with some claiming the horse had nearly kicked. Dr. Winters worked to temper expectations, reminding everyone that a single muscle contraction was far from functional recovery, but she couldn't completely hide her own surprise at the development. "I've never seen anything like it," she admitted to Jessica as they reviewed the morning's therapy notes. In human medicine, yes, but with spinal trauma this severe in an equine patient, it defies conventional prognosis. Jessica watched through her office window as Henry sat outside the medical barn in his wheelchair, soaking up the mid-June sunshine while poring over his ever-present notebook. "Maybe we've been underestimating the power of sheer determination," she said softly. The next day brought oppressive Texas heat, the temperature climbing toward 95 degrees before 10 a.m. Rachel adjusted the therapy schedule, moving sessions to early morning and late evening to avoid the worst of the heat. "We'll just do maintenance massage and electrical stimulation during the day," she told the volunteer vet techs. No sense risking heat stress by taking him to the lake at noon. Henry, however, refused to alter his routine. Every 3 hours, he wheeled himself to Storm's stall for what he called their pep talks, one-sided conversations where he detailed the day's progress and plans for tomorrow. "You did good yesterday," Henry told the horse, offering a slice of apple from his palm. "But we need more than a twitch to impress the skeptics. Gotta show them you can control those muscles, not just fire them randomly." Storm's ears pricked forward, his attention focused entirely on the old man. In the 4 weeks since the accident, their bond had grown almost uncanny. The great black horse, once known for his aloofness with most handlers, now nickered softly whenever Henry entered the barn. "He loves you," Emily declared that evening, perched on a hay bale as she watched Henry prepare the electrical stimulation pads for Storm's evening treatment. She had appointed herself Henry's unofficial assistant, handing him supplies and chattering constantly about her unwavering belief in Storm's eventual recovery. "Nah," Henry replied, though a smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "He just knows I'm the one with the treats." Emily shook her head decisively, her blonde ponytail swinging. "Nah, he watches the door when you're late. He gets worried." Henry paused, looking up at her with sudden interest. "Worried how?" "He paws the ground and makes that low whinnying sound," she explained. "Like yesterday when your physical therapy session went long and you were 30 minutes late. The volunteers tried to start without you, but he wouldn't cooperate until you got here." Henry considered this, turning to study Storm thoughtfully. "Is that right, boy? You holding out for me specifically?" He ran a hand along the horse's neck. "Well, I'm flattered, but you need to work with the whole team. We're all trying to help you." "I told him that," Emily said solemnly. "But he likes you best because you're both fighters." Henry chuckled. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured. The following morning brought the first significant setback. Storm seemed listless during his lake therapy, his head hanging low, his response to stimuli diminished. "His temperature's up," Dr. Winters announced after a quick examination. 102.6, that's definitely elevated. And his left hind leg is warmer than the right. Rachel's face tightened with concern. "Infection? Possibly. I'm going to draw blood and start him on broad-spectrum antibiotics until we get results. This could be serious." The next 48 hours were tense. Storm's temperature continued to rise, reaching 104 degrees despite aggressive treatment. Henry refused to leave the medical barn, sleeping in his wheelchair beside Storm's stall. "You need to rest in a proper bed," Rachel urged. "Your own health. We'll be fine," Henry finished firmly. "I've lived through worse than a sore back from sleeping upright." On the third night of Storm's fever, a violent thunderstorm rolled across Willow Creek. The same conditions that had led to his accident now returned, lightning illuminating the medical barn in harsh flashes, thunder rattling the windows. Henry dozed fitfully, jerking awake at each thunderclap. During one such moment of wakefulness, he noticed Storm trembling, his eyes wide with apparent fear. "It's all right, boy," Henry soothed, wheeling closer. "Just a storm. Can't hurt you in here." The horse's trembling intensified with the next thunderclap. Henry frowned, then made a connection. "The accident," he murmured. "You remember the storm when you fell?" He reached for Storm's halter, stroking his forehead gently. "That was different. You were saving Daisy. You were being a hero." Storm's breathing quickened, his nostrils flaring. Henry continued talking, his voice deliberately calm and steady despite the chaos outside. "You know, my stroke happened during a storm too. Electrical storm in my brain to match the one outside. Woke up in hospital with half my body not working anymore." He kept his hand on Storm's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath his fingers. Was afraid of storms for a while after. Silly, I know? As if weather could strike me down twice. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the barn, and Storm jerked in fear. To Henry's astonishment, the movement included a powerful contraction of his hindquarters, not just a twitch this time, but a substantial shift of his hindquarters. Storm, Henry whispered, hardly daring to believe what he'd seen. Did you just... Another lightning flash, another clap of thunder. Storm's reaction was unmistakable, a fear response that engaged muscles everyone had thought were completely paralyzed. His hind legs scrambled against the bedding, not coordinated movement, but definitely intentional muscle contractions. Henry's hand shot out to the emergency call button installed beside Storm's stall. Within minutes, Dr. Winters arrived, hair disheveled from sleep, pulling a raincoat over her pajamas. "What's happened?" she demanded, rushing to Storm's side. "The thunder," Henry explained excitedly, pointing to the window as another flash lit up the night. "Watch his response. Watch his hind legs." Dr. Winters observed in astonishment as the pattern repeated, fear triggering a survival response that somehow bypassed the spinal damage. "This is remarkable," she breathed. "The adrenaline response must be creating alternate neural pathways." By morning, the storm had passed, but its impact remained. Rachel arrived at dawn to find her uncle and Dr. Winters reviewing video footage captured on the barn's security cameras. "The fear response is unlocking something," Dr. Winters explained, showing Rachel the clips of Storm's movements. "There's clearly some neural connectivity that we weren't detecting in our standard examinations." Rachel studied the footage, her professional excitement building. "We need to incorporate this into his therapy immediately. Not the fear, obviously, but the principle of emotional engagement triggering physical response." "Already working on it," Henry said, tapping his notebook where he'd been scribbling ideas since 3 a.m. "Emily mentioned yesterday that Storm responds differently to me than to other handlers. There's an emotional component there we can leverage." Dr. Winters looked skeptical. "That's a pretty big leap from a stress response to..." "Not really," Rachel interrupted. "In human rehabilitation, we see this all the time. Patients who can't perform movements in clinical settings suddenly can, when emotionally motivated, to catch a falling child, to reach for something they deeply want." Henry's eyes lit up. "Exactly. We've been approaching this too clinically. Storm's not just a collection of damaged nerves and muscles. He's a thinking, feeling being with motivations and preferences." The next morning, they tried a new approach. Instead of the usual passive exercises in the lake, Henry positioned himself at the far end of the therapy area, just out of Storm's reach. In his hands, he held Storm's favorite treats. "Come on, boy," he called encouragingly. "Just a little movement. Show me what you did last night." For 15 frustrating minutes, nothing happened. Storm stood suspended in his harness, seemingly content to remain stationary despite Henry's coaxing. Then Emily, watching from the platform, had an idea. "Mr. Henry, maybe you should pretend to leave," she suggested. "Like you're giving up and going away." Henry raised an eyebrow, but decided to try it. He made a show of sighing in disappointment, turning his wheelchair around and moving slowly away from the edge of the lake. The change in Storm was immediate and dramatic. The horse let out a distressed whinny, and his right hind leg pushed against the lake bottom in a clear attempt to follow. It wasn't coordinated or strong, but it was unmistakably voluntary. "That's it," Henry exclaimed, immediately wheeling back. "Good boy, Storm. That's exactly what we want." Rachel, standing in the water beside Storm, looked up with tears in her eyes. "Uncle Henry, do you realize what this means? There's definitely neural connectivity. The pathways exist, we just need to find the right way to access them." From that day forward, their therapy approach transformed. Each session now incorporated emotional motivation alongside the physical exercises. Henry became the focal point, his presence or absence a key tool in eliciting responses from Storm. Progress accelerated dramatically, with new achievements almost daily. First controlled muscle contractions, then partial weight bearing in the water, then brief moments of supported standing on land. At the 1-month review meeting, Jessica found herself facing an entirely different situation than she had anticipated. Based on the documented progress, Dr. Winters reported, showing video compilations of Storm's therapy sessions, "I have to revise my prognosis. While I'm still not confident about full recovery, There's clear evidence of functional improvement that exceeds anything in the veterinary literature for this type of injury. Jessica turned to Henry and Rachel. I think it's clear our agreement needs to be extended. You've more than met the condition of showing measurable improvement. Henry nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. Told you he was a fighter. As they left the meeting, Rachel squeezed her uncle's shoulder. You know we're still facing enormous challenges, she cautioned. This is just the beginning. Henry looked toward the medical barn where Storm waited, a new experimental standing harness ready for its first trial. Beginning's all we needed, he said simply. Rest is just persistence. By the 6-week mark of Storm's rehabilitation, news of the unprecedented recovery had begun to spread beyond Hope Ranch. A local newspaper ran a feature story titled Second Chances, The Remarkable Recovery of Storm, complete with photographs of the horse partially supporting his own weight in his specialized therapy harness. The article highlighted the unorthodox approach developed by Henry and Rachel Carter, describing it as a revolution in equine rehabilitation medicine. Dr. Winters found herself fielding calls from colleagues across Texas and neighboring states, all curious about the therapy protocols that were yielding such surprising results. Initially reluctant to draw attention to what she still considered an experimental approach, she eventually agreed to host a small observational seminar for interested veterinarians. Just to be clear, she told the group of 12 veterinary specialists who gathered in Hope Ranch's conference room one humid July morning, we're not claiming a miracle cure. Storm still has significant neurological deficits, and full recovery remains unlikely. What we're demonstrating is the potential for meaningful functional improvement in cases previously considered hopeless. The visiting veterinarians reviewed Storm's medical records, X-rays, and therapy videos with professional skepticism that gradually gave way to genuine interest. When the time came for a live demonstration of the water therapy session, the group watched in stunned silence as Storm, supported by his custom harness in the lake, deliberately moved his hind legs in a walking motion while following Henry's wheelchair along the platform. The neural pathways we're accessing aren't the primary ones damaged in the accident, Rachel explained, standing waist-deep in the water beside Storm. We're essentially teaching his nervous system to reroute commands through secondary pathways, similar to how the brain reroutes after a stroke. Dr. Eliza Johnston, an equine neurological specialist from Colorado State University, shook her head in amazement. I've never seen anything like this. In conventional veterinary medicine, we'd have euthanized this horse weeks ago. That was the recommendation, Jessica confirmed. If Henry hadn't intervened, all eyes turned to the elderly man in the wheelchair, who was completely focused on encouraging Storm's movements, seemingly oblivious to the professional attention. A little more, boy, he called, holding out an apple. That's it. Right hind, then left. Remember the pattern we practiced. Dr. Johnston moved closer to Rachel in the water. The emotional component you mentioned, the horse's attachment to Mr. Carter, that's not something we typically factor into rehabilitation protocols. Rachel nodded. It's been crucial. When Storm shows signs of fatigue or frustration, my uncle can motivate him to continue in ways none of the rest of us can. They've developed a communication that transcends conventional handling techniques. It's more than just a rehabilitation program, Dr. Winters added. It's become a complete rethinking of how we approach catastrophic injuries in large animals. After the demonstration, the specialists gathered around Henry, peppering him with questions about his background and experience. He answered with characteristic brevity, emphasizing practical application over theory. Nothing complicated about it, he insisted. Animals, like people, need a reason to fight. Pain avoidance isn't enough. They need something positive to work toward. Dr. Johnston lingered after the others had departed, reviewing Storm's therapy logs with Rachel. With your permission, she said finally, I'd like to document this case for the Journal of Equine Veterinary Science. This could change standard protocols for spinal injury cases. Rachel glanced at her uncle, who was supervising Storm's return to his specially modified stall. I think that would be appropriate, she agreed. But the credit belongs primarily to Uncle Henry. This was his vision from the start. The publication of Dr. Johnston's preliminary case study 2 weeks later brought a new wave of attention. Veterinary students from Texas A&M asked to observe therapy sessions as part of their clinical rotations. A manufacturer of equine rehabilitation equipment offered to donate a more sophisticated underwater treadmill system. The local television station ran a human interest story featuring Emily explaining Storm's progress to the camera with a child's unshakable confidence. "He's going to walk again all by himself," she declared. Mr. Henry promised, and Mr. Henry never breaks promises. With the growing attention came both opportunities and complications. Jessica found herself managing media requests and visitor schedules alongside the ranch's normal operations. Dr. Winters spent hours documenting every aspect of Storm's therapy for the rapidly expanding case study. And Henry, unused to being the center of attention, grew increasingly protective of Storm's rehabilitation routine. "Too many observers," he complained one evening as Rachel helped him review the next day's therapy plan. "Storm gets nervous with strangers watching. Disrupts his concentration. They're here because what you've accomplished is extraordinary," Rachel reminded him gently. "You've changed how people think about these injuries." Henry shook his head. "Haven't accomplished anything yet. Not until he can stand on his own." The breakthrough they had been working toward came during the 8th week of rehabilitation. They had progressed to land-based therapy sessions using a specialized harness system that could gradually decrease the amount of weight support provided. Storm could now bear approximately 30% of his weight on his hind legs for short periods, though full independent standing remained elusive. During one such session, Dr. Winters was monitoring Storm's vital signs while Rachel adjusted the harness settings. Henry sat nearby in his wheelchair, talking to Storm in the low, steady voice that always seemed to calm the horse. "Remember how we practiced yesterday," he said. "Find your balance point. Trust your legs to hold you." Dr. Winters checked her watch. 2 minutes at 30% support. That's a new record. Rachel nodded, focused on the control panel. "Let's try reducing support to 25%, just for 30 seconds. As she adjusted the settings, the machinery emitted a sudden grinding noise. Storm startled, his eyes widening in alarm as the harness jerked slightly. "Malfunction," Rachel said tensely. "I need to reset the system." But before she could reach the controls, the unexpected occurred. As the harness support faltered momentarily, Storm compensated instinctively, bearing more of his own weight than ever before. For 5 breathtaking seconds, the horse stood almost entirely under his own power, his legs trembling with effort, but holding. Henry leaned forward in his wheelchair, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's it, boy. You've got it." The moment passed as Rachel stabilized the harness system, but the implications were enormous. Dr. Winters was already reviewing the data recorded by their monitoring equipment. "He took nearly 70% of his own weight for those few seconds," she confirmed, her professional reserve cracking into open excitement. That's beyond what we thought possible at this stage." Henry wheeled closer to Storm, reaching up to stroke the horse's neck. "Not beyond what he thought possible," he corrected. "We've been underestimating him all along." That evening, after Storm had been returned to his stall and the day's therapy data meticulously recorded, Jessica called an impromptu celebration in the ranch's common room. Staff members, residents, and volunteers gathered for cake and sparkling cider, toasting the unexpected milestone. In a quiet corner, Dr. Johnston spoke with Rachel while watching Henry accept congratulations from his fellow elder care residents. "This has implications far beyond one horse," she said. "The protocols you've developed here could transform veterinary rehabilitation. We're already adapting elements of your approach for a case in our university clinic, a 3-year-old quarter horse with a traumatic injury very similar to Storm's." Rachel nodded, her eyes on her uncle. "It's his legacy," she said softly. "After his stroke, he thought his life's work was over. This has given him purpose again, not just helping Storm, but potentially helping countless other animals." Across the room, Emily tugged at Henry's sleeve, her expression serious. "Mr. Henry," she said loudly enough for nearby conversations to pause, "when Storm can stand all by himself, will you let me ride him again?" A hush fell over the gathering. Henry considered the child's question with the gravity it deserved. "That's up to Storm," he answered finally. "And it's still a long way off. But if he keeps fighting like he has been, I wouldn't bet against it." Jessica stepped forward, raising her glass. "To Storm," she proposed, "and to Henry Carter, who refused to give up when the rest of us had already accepted defeat." As glasses clinked around him, Henry's weathered face creased into a rare, full smile. To second chances, he amended. And to the people brave enough to take them. The late August heat pressed down on Hope Ranch like a heavy blanket. 3 months had passed since Storm's accident, and the medical barn had been transformed into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility. The donated underwater treadmill now occupied a dedicated room with observation windows. The therapy area featured customized support systems and sensor-equipped flooring that measured weight distribution with each step. Henry's cottage had gradually emptied as his rehabilitation equipment migrated to the barn. Even his bed remained frequently unused, as he spent most nights in the makeshift apartment Jessica had created for him adjacent to Storm's specialized stall. "You can't keep this pace up," Rachel cautioned one morning, finding her uncle already awake and reviewing therapy data despite the early hour. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Henry dismissed her concern with a wave. "I've never felt better," he insisted, and there was truth in his words. Though still dependent on his wheelchair for longer distances, he now regularly stood and took several steps during his own physical therapy sessions. His speech had improved dramatically, and the tremor in his right hand had diminished. Dr. Winters had noted the parallel recoveries with professional interest. "There's something remarkable happening between those two," she told Jessica during their weekly progress meeting. "Henry's functionality has improved at almost the same rate as Storm's." "They're healing each other," Jessica observed. That day's therapy session was scheduled to test a significant milestone: Storm's ability to stand completely unsupported for a full minute. The specialized harness would remain in place, but entirely slack, ready to engage only if the horse began to fall. A small audience gathered behind the observation window. Dr. Johnston and 2 colleagues from Colorado State University, several of the eldercare residents who had become Storm's unofficial fan club, and Emily, who had been allowed to skip school for this special occasion. Inside the therapy area, Rachel monitored the equipment settings while Dr. Winters checked Storm's vital signs one last time. Henry positioned his wheelchair directly in front of Storm at the endpoint of the 10-foot walking path they had established. "Ready when you are," Rachel announced, her finger hovering over the control that would gradually release the harness support. Henry nodded, his eyes locked with Storm's. "Let's show them what we can do, boy," he said quietly. The harness system hummed as it slowly transferred Storm's weight from the mechanical support to his own legs. The monitoring screens displayed real-time data, heart rate increasing slightly, muscle activity intensifying in the hindquarters, weight distribution shifting. "Support at 20%, Rachel called. 15%, 10%. Storm's legs trembled visibly now, but he remained upright, his attention fixed on Henry. 5%, Rachel continued. 3-1-0. He's standing on his own. A collective gasp came from behind the observation glass. Dr. Winters started the timer on her watch, her expression a mixture of professional assessment and barely contained amazement. "Good boy," Henry encouraged, his voice steady and calm despite the tension evident in his posture. "Find your balance. Remember what we practiced." The seconds ticked by. Storm's muscles quivered with effort, but his stance remained solid. Behind him, his tail swished once, twice, a normal behavior that seemed miraculous in this context. 30 seconds, Dr. Winters announced. Henry slowly raised his right hand, holding Storm's favorite apple just out of reach. "Come get it, boy," he urged. Just one step. The gathered observers held their breath. Storm shifted his weight slightly, his front right hoof lifting an inch off the ground before setting back down. Testing, preparing. 45 seconds of independent standing, Dr. Winters called, her professionalism giving way to excitement. This already exceeds all expectations. Then, just as the timer reached 58 seconds, Storm did the impossible. His front right leg moved forward 6 inches, a deliberate, controlled step. His left front followed. Then, with visible effort but unmistakable intent, his right hind leg advanced. "He's walking," Rachel whispered, hands frozen over the control panel. "Uncle Henry, he's actually walking." The left hind leg dragged slightly, but still moved forward, completing a full step cycle. Then another. Storm progressed haltingly toward Henry, each step more confident than the last, until he reached the wheelchair and lowered his head to take the apple from Henry's outstretched palm. Behind the glass, Emily jumped up and down, clapping her hands in delight. He did it. He did it, she shouted, her voice audible even through the thick window. For a moment, no one in the therapy area spoke. Storm stood before Henry's wheelchair, legs still trembling but supporting his weight, crunching the apple as if what he had just accomplished wasn't medically miraculous. Dr. Winters finally broke the silence. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 26 years, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like this. It shouldn't be possible." Henry reached up to stroke Storm's forehead. "Didn't you hear?" he said, his weathered face creased in a smile. Nobody told him it was impossible. The video of Storm's first steps, captured by the therapy room's monitoring cameras, spread rapidly through veterinary circles. Within days, it had been viewed by specialists across the country and featured in several professional webinars. What had begun as a local human interest story was now being discussed as a potential paradigm shift in equine rehabilitation. That evening, as the excitement finally began to settle, Henry sat alone with Storm in the quiet barn. The horse stood in his stall, a specially designed support sling available, but unnecessary as he balanced comfortably on all four legs. "We showed them, didn't we?" Henry murmured, offering another apple slice. "All those experts who said it couldn't be done." Storm's soft muzzle tickled Henry's palm as he took the treat. In the 3 months of their journey together, the bond between them had deepened beyond explanation. Sometimes Henry felt the horse understood his words completely, not just as trained commands, but as true communication. "I had my own experts, you know," Henry continued, more to himself than to Storm. "After my stroke, specialists who showed me scans of my brain, all those damaged areas that would never recover." He flexed his right hand, now strong enough to hold a brush and groom Storm without assistance. "Turns out they were wrong about both of us." The barn door opened, and Rachel entered with Emily bouncing excitedly at her side. "We brought dinner," Rachel announced, holding up a picnic basket. Emily insisted we celebrate properly. Emily approached Storm's stall carefully. She had been well trained in safety protocols, but her face shone with uncontained joy. "I knew you could do it," she told the horse seriously. "I told everyone, but some people didn't believe me." Henry chuckled. "Smart folks learn to listen to you, young lady. You've got good instincts." As they shared sandwiches and lemonade in the barn aisle, Emily peppered them with questions about what would happen next. "Will Storm go back to being a regular horse now? Can he go in the pasture with the others? When can I ride him?" Rachel fielded most of the questions, explaining that Storm still had a long rehabilitation journey ahead. "Today was amazing," she said, "but he's still building strength and coordination. We'll increase his daily walking gradually, add some gentle slopes and different terrain once he's ready. But he will get all the way better, right?" Emily persisted. Henry and Rachel exchanged a glance. "He'll never be exactly the same as before the accident," Henry said carefully. "Injuries like his leave permanent changes. But he'll have a good life, with purpose and dignity. That's what matters." Emily considered this, her small face serious. "Like you, Mr. Henry. You're different after your stroke, but you still have a good life, right?" Henry blinked, momentarily taken aback by the child's perceptiveness. "That's right," he agreed. "Different, but still worthwhile. Maybe even better in some ways." After Emily had gone home and Rachel had returned to her temporary quarters in the guest cottage, Henry remained in the quiet barn. The evening feeding was complete, and most of the horses were settling down for the night, but Storm remained alert, watching Henry through the stall bars. "Big day tomorrow," Henry told him. "Reporters coming from some fancy horse magazine. More veterinarians, too." He sighed, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "Lot of fuss and bother, but it's important. What we figured out together might help other horses like you." Storm nickered softly, bumping the stall door with his nose as if urging Henry to continue. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Henry said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That first meeting after your accident, when they all said you couldn't be saved." He shook his head slowly. "If I hadn't been there that day, if I hadn't overheard them talking about putting you down." The horse stepped closer to the stall door, lowering his head to Henry's eye level. "Strange how life works," Henry continued. "Spent my whole career helping horses recover from injuries, then had my stroke and thought those days were over. Ended up here at Hope Ranch thinking I was just waiting out my time." He reached through the bars to stroke Storm's cheek. "But turns out I had one more patient to help. And maybe you had one more human to save, too. Storm exhaled softly, his breath warm against Henry's hand. In the quiet barn, with no audience or cameras or medical professionals, the old physical therapist slowly pushed himself up from his wheelchair. Gripping the stall door for support, he stood face to face with the horse the world had given up for lost. "Look at us now," Henry said softly, "both standing on our own 4 feet." He smiled, the deep lines in his face creasing with genuine joy. Not bad for a couple of old fighters everyone had written off. The morning of the 1-year anniversary of Storm's accident dawned with perfect Texas clarity. Cobalt skies stretching endlessly above Hope Ranch. The September air crisp and energizing after months of punishing summer heat. The ranch had been transformed for the occasion, with a festival atmosphere replacing the usual working routine. Colorful pennants fluttered from fence posts. Information booths showcased the revolutionary rehabilitation techniques developed there, and visitors from across the country mingled with residents and staff. Jessica Hayes had initially planned a small ceremony to mark Storm's remarkable recovery, but the event had grown organically into something much larger. The Hope Ranch Recovery Symposium now included presentations from veterinary specialists, demonstrations of adaptive equipment, and even a fundraiser for a new scholarship program for veterinary students interested in rehabilitation medicine. "I hardly recognize the place," Rachel remarked, surveying the transformed property from the porch of Henry's cottage. "Did you ever imagine it would come to this when you first stood up for Storm?" Henry adjusted the collar of his dress shirt, a concession to the formality of the day, though he had stubbornly refused to wear a tie. "Never about recognition," he said, watching as another car pulled into the already crowded parking area. "Just about doing right by a horse that deserved a chance." Rachel smiled, noting how her uncle sat in his wheelchair rather than stood, conserving his energy for the day ahead. His own recovery had plateaued in recent months. He could walk short distances with a cane, but still relied on the wheelchair for anything longer than 50 yards. Yet the improvements he had achieved alongside Storm's rehabilitation had far exceeded his doctor's expectations. "The film crew is already setting up by the main arena," she told him. "And Dr. Johnston says the live stream has over 3,000 veterinarians registered to watch worldwide." Henry grumbled something about unnecessary fuss, but couldn't completely hide his satisfaction. The Henry Carter Protocol, as it had been formally named in the veterinary literature, was now being implemented in rehabilitation centers across the country. What had begun as one man's stubborn refusal to give up had evolved into a systematic approach that was changing outcomes for injured animals previously considered beyond help. A soft knock at the door preceded Emily's entrance. At 8 years old now, she had appointed herself Henry's official assistant for the day, solemnly responsible for ensuring he arrived at each scheduled appearance on time. She had dressed for the occasion in jeans, boots, and a Western shirt that matched the blue of her eyes, her blonde hair neatly braided. "It's time, Mr. Henry," she announced. "Everyone's waiting at the barn for the first demonstration." Henry allowed Rachel to wheel him along the paved path toward the main rehabilitation barn, now expanded and renovated thanks to grants and donations that had poured in after Storm's story gained national attention. Emily walked alongside, occasionally running ahead to greet familiar faces or investigate interesting displays. The crowd parted respectfully as they approached. Henry nodded in acknowledgement, but remained uncomfortable with the celebrity status that had been thrust upon him. He was here for Storm and for the other animals that might be helped by what they'd learned, not for applause or recognition. Inside the demonstration area, Dr. Winters waited with several veterinary students and the film crew. The therapy space had been arranged to showcase Storm's current abilities: a gently sloping ramp, a soft obstacle course of ground poles, and an open area for unstructured movement. "Where is he?" Henry asked, searching the space for the familiar black shape. Dr. Winters smiled mysteriously. "Jessica thought we'd make a proper entrance. He's waiting in the preparation area." The room quickly filled to capacity. Observers pressed against the viewing windows, and the camera operators adjusted their equipment for optimal coverage. Dr. Johnston stepped forward to introduce the demonstration, her academic tone barely containing her excitement as she outlined the journey from catastrophic injury to functional recovery. "What makes the Carter Protocol unique," she explained to the audience, "is its holistic integration of physical therapy with cognitive and emotional engagement. The bond between patient and therapist becomes a central component of the rehabilitation process, not merely a pleasant side effect. Henry shifted impatiently in his wheelchair. The technical explanations had their place, but he was eager to see Storm, to check his condition, assess his comfort level amidst all the excitement and strangers. Finally, Dr. Johnston concluded her introduction. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present the horse that changed everything we thought we knew about spinal recovery in equines. Please welcome Storm, with his handler, Jessica Hayes. The side door opened, and Storm entered the demonstration area at a controlled walk. His coat gleamed blue-black under the lights, his powerful frame showing no obvious signs of his earlier paralysis. Jessica walked beside him with a lead rope that hung slack, a safety precaution only, as the horse moved deliberately under his own guidance. Henry leaned forward, his expert eye cataloging every aspect of Storm's movement. The right hind leg still lifted slightly differently than the left, and there was a subtle asymmetry to his weight distribution, permanent reminders of the injury. But to the untrained observer, Storm appeared remarkably normal, a beautiful horse moving with power and dignity. The audience burst into applause as Storm completed a circuit of the demonstration area. Henry felt Rachel's hand squeeze his shoulder, a gesture of shared triumph in this moment that had once seemed impossible. Dr. Winters stepped forward to explain Storm's current capabilities. He now moves independently on all terrain, can trot for short periods, and maintains his balance even on uneven ground. While he will always have some neurological deficits, his functional recovery has exceeded every prediction made after his injury. As the demonstration proceeded, Storm negotiated the obstacle course with careful precision, lifting his feet over ground poles and maintaining his balance on the foam mattresses designed to test proprioception. Throughout it all, his attention repeatedly returned to Henry, his ears pricking forward whenever the old man spoke or moved. "We call this the anchor relationship in the Carter Protocol," Dr. Johnston explained to the audience. "The establishment of a primary emotional connection that motivates the patient beyond physical capability alone." After the formal demonstration concluded, the crowd filtered outside for refreshments and to visit the other exhibits. Henry remained in the now-quiet therapy area, finally alone with Storm, who had immediately approached his wheelchair once the audience departed. "You put on quite a show, boy," Henry said, running his hands along Storm's neck and shoulders, checking muscle tone and responses with the automatic habits of a lifetime in rehabilitation work. "How are you feeling? Tiring at all?" Storm nudged Henry's chest gently with his muzzle, then stood perfectly still, as if waiting. Jessica returned, leading Emily by the hand. The little girl could barely contain her excitement, bouncing on her toes as she approached. "Is it time?" she asked breathlessly. "Can we do it now?" Jessica looked to Henry for confirmation. "We should proceed with the second demonstration before he tires," she suggested. "If you're ready." Henry nodded, suddenly serious. What they planned next was significant, a calculated risk, but one they had prepared for meticulously over the past month. It would be the ultimate demonstration of Storm's recovery, but more importantly, the fulfillment of a promise made to a child who had never stopped believing. While Jessica readied Storm with a specially designed bareback pad and safety harness, Rachel helped Henry stand from his wheelchair. Using his cane for support, he walked slowly to the mounting block positioned at the center of the therapy area. "Remember," Rachel cautioned, "just a brief circuit. Don't push either of your limits." The film crew, alerted that something special was about to occur, quietly re-entered the space, cameras rolling. Dr. Winters and Dr. Johnston stood to the side, their professional interest evident but secondary to the emotional significance of the moment. Emily climbed the mounting block first, her small face solemn with the responsibility entrusted to her. Jessica helped position her on the bareback pad, securing the safety harness around her waist and checking the special handholds designed for maximum stability with minimum pressure on Storm's back. "How does he feel?" Henry asked, watching Storm's reactions carefully. Emily's face broke into a radiant smile. "Strong," she replied simply, "like he was always meant to carry me." Jessica led Storm in a careful circle, ensuring he was comfortable with Emily's weight and position. The horse moved with deliberate care, as if consciously aware of his precious cargo. "I think they're ready," Jessica said, returning to the mounting block. Henry handed his cane to Rachel and gripped the mounting block railing. With careful movements that spoke of his own ongoing rehabilitation, he climbed the 3 steps. Storm was positioned perfectly, standing rock-steady as Henry carefully swung his right leg over and settled behind Emily. A collective gasp came from the observers who had begun to gather at the windows. Dr. Johnston hastily explained to the camera crew, "This is unprecedented. The first time since the injury that Storm has carried riders. And particularly significant that it's Mr. Carter, himself still recovering from a stroke." But Henry paid no attention to the cameras or commentary. His focus narrowed to the connection between himself, Emily, and Storm. 3 bodies moving as one as Jessica opened the gate to the small outdoor arena adjacent to the therapy room. Sunshine washed over them as they emerged into the perfect September day. The festival attendees fell silent, forming a respectful corridor as Storm carried his 2 riders in a slow, dignified walk across the arena. Emily's face shone with joy, her small hands steady on the safety holds. Behind her, Henry sat tall, his decades of horsemanship evident in his balanced seat and subtle guidance. They completed one full circuit of the arena, Storm's movements smooth and confident despite the unaccustomed weight. As they approached the gate to return to the therapy room, Jessica stepped forward to help them dismount, but Henry shook his head slightly. Instead, he leaned forward and spoke quietly into Storm's ear. The great black horse halted, then performed a movement they had practiced privately, away from observers, a dignified bow, lowering his front legs to kneel briefly before the gathered crowd. The audience erupted in applause and cheers. Emily twisted to look up at Henry, her expression a mixture of surprise and delight. "You taught him that secret trick," she exclaimed. "You said we'd save it for a special day?" Henry smiled, his weathered face momentarily unguarded with pure joy. "Can't think of a more special day than this," he replied. Later, as the afternoon light lengthened into golden evening, the formal events concluded and most visitors departed. A smaller gathering assembled on the grassy hill overlooking the ranch. Henry and Rachel, Jessica and the key staff, Emily and her parents, and the veterinary team that had been part of Storm's journey. Storm grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check Henry's location, the invisible bond between them as strong as ever. In the pasture below, other horses rescued by Hope Ranch moved about their evening routines, unaware of their role in a story that had touched thousands. Emily sat cross-legged beside Henry's chair, working intently on a flower crown she was weaving from wildflowers. "This is for Storm," she explained, "to show he's a hero." "He certainly is," Rachel agreed. "But do you know who else is a hero?" She glanced meaningfully at her uncle. Emily nodded solemnly. "Mr. Henry. Because heroes are people who don't give up when things get hard." Jessica raised her glass in a toast. "To Storm and Henry," she said, "who taught us all about second chances." "And to Hope Ranch," Henry added, looking out over the property that had become so much more than a retirement facility. "May it continue giving second chances to those who need them most." As twilight settled over Willow Creek, Henry watched Storm grazing contentedly, moving with only the slightest hint of his former paralysis. The journey had transformed them both, 2 broken bodies healing alongside each other, defying medical predictions and expert opinions through sheer determination and the mysterious power of connection. "You know," Henry said quietly to Rachel, "when I first came to Hope Ranch, I thought my useful days were over. Thought I was just waiting to die." He gestured toward the Rehabilitation Center, now a nationally recognized facility implementing the protocols that bore his name. "Never imagined all this." Rachel squeezed his hand. "Sometimes the most important chapters of our lives come when we least expect them." Henry nodded, his eyes following Storm's movements across the hillside. "I saved him," he acknowledged, "but he saved me right back." As stars began to appear in the Texas sky, the small group remained on the hillside, sharing stories and memories of the remarkable year behind them. And below, illuminated by the first moonlight, Storm raised his head to gaze at the elderly man in the wheelchair. 2 fighters who had refused to accept the limitations others had placed upon them, writing their own ending to a story that had seemed destined for tragedy. In the soft evening light, they were more than just man and horse. They were living proof that sometimes, against all odds and expert opinions, Refusing to give up can create miracles that change not just 2 lives, but countless others in their wake. The crisp October morning painted the Texas countryside in shades of amber and gold. 2 years had passed since Storm's accident, and Hope Ranch had undergone a transformation as remarkable as the Black Stallion's recovery. What had once been a modest horse rescue and elder care facility now stood as the country's premier equine rehabilitation center, with veterinarians and researchers from across the world applying for residencies and training opportunities. The new Carter Rehabilitation Wing stretched along the eastern edge of the property, a state-of-the-art facility funded by grants, donations, and the licensing of specialized equipment developed during Storm's recovery. Inside, 3 horses with spinal and neurological injuries worked through personalized therapy programs based on the protocols that had become standard treatment for conditions once considered untreatable. Henry Carter made his way slowly down the center aisle of the therapy barn, leaning lightly on his cane. At 80, his body remained marked by the stroke that had changed his life's trajectory, but regular physical therapy and the daily demands of his work had maintained his hard-won mobility. His hair had thinned further, pure white now against his sun-weathered skin, but his blue eyes retained their sharp intelligence and unwavering determination. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," called Juan Martinez, a young veterinarian who had joined the staff 6 months earlier after completing his specialized training in equine neurology. "Here to see our new arrival?" Henry nodded, making his way to the last stall where a chestnut mare had been installed the previous evening. Transferred from a racing stable in Kentucky, she had suffered a fall during training that had left her partially paralyzed. Exactly the type of case that would have meant automatic euthanasia before Storm had changed the paradigm of what was possible. "How's she settling in?" Henry asked, studying the mare's posture and eyes with practiced assessment. "Better than expected," Juan replied. "She's alert, taking food and water. Dr. Winters completed the initial evaluation this morning and thinks she's an excellent candidate for the protocol." Henry opened the stall door carefully, speaking softly as he approached the injured horse. "Hello there, Miss Liberty," he greeted her, using the name from her registration papers. "Welcome to your second chance." From the observation room above the therapy area, Rachel watched her uncle with a mixture of pride and concern. Though he refused to acknowledge it, age was gradually catching up with him. He tired more easily now, sometimes needing midday rest that he would have scoffed at a year ago. Yet his dedication remained unwavering, his presence at the center as constant as the Texas sunrise. "He's remarkable," said Dr. Eliza Johnston, who had returned to Hope Ranch for her quarterly assessment of the program. "Most men his age would have retired years ago, especially after a stroke." Rachel smiled. "I don't think retirement is a concept Uncle Henry recognizes. This work gives him purpose. It's not just a job to him." "The Carter Protocol has saved hundreds of horses across the country in the past 2 years, Dr. Johnston remarked. "The research paper we published in the Journal of Veterinary Medicine last month is already the most downloaded in the publication's history. He's created a legacy that will outlive us all." Below them, Henry completed his assessment of Liberty and made his way toward the private paddock at the rear of the facility. As he emerged into the sunshine, a familiar whinny greeted him. Storm, now 9 years old and in the prime of his life, trotted across the grass to meet him at the fence. "There's my boy," Henry said, stroking the glossy black neck that arched above the fence rail. "Ready for our rounds today?" The bond between them remained undiminished by time. Though Storm now participated in therapy sessions with other patients, his calm presence seeming to reassure newly injured horses that recovery was possible, his special connection with Henry endured. 3 days each week, weather permitting, they made community rounds together, visiting schools, nursing homes, and veterans rehabilitation centers throughout Willow Creek and neighboring towns. Their visits had a near magical effect, particularly in rehabilitation settings. Henry would share their story while Storm demonstrated his recovered mobility, living proof that devastating injuries could be overcome. For patients struggling through their own recovery journeys, the pair offered something more valuable than medical assurances. They offered tangible hope. "Mr. Henry, Mr. Henry." Emily's voice carried across the paddock as she ran toward them, her blonde hair streaming behind her. Now 10 years old, she had grown leggy and sun-browned, but her exuberance remained unchanged. Don't forget we have to leave early today for the presentation. Henry chuckled. As if you'd let me forget, young lady. The presentation was the culmination of months of planning, the official launch of the Emily Patterson Jr. Rehabilitation Program. What had begun as the little girl's school project had evolved into a structured curriculum for children interested in animal therapy and rehabilitation. With Henry's guidance and Jessica's organizational support, the program would introduce young people to careers in veterinary medicine while providing valuable socialization for recovering animals. That afternoon, the main arena at Hope Ranch filled with families, local officials, and media representatives. Emily stood at the microphone with remarkable poise for her age, explaining how her experience with Storm had inspired her to create opportunities for other children. When I was 7, she told the audience, no one thought Storm would ever walk again. But Mr. Henry taught me that sometimes, when you believe in someone, even if they have 4 legs instead of 2, amazing things can happen. As she spoke, Henry and Storm entered the arena together. Though Henry used his cane, he walked independently beside the horse, who matched his pace perfectly. The symbolism was lost on no one. Man and horse, each injured, each told they would never recover, moving forward together with dignity and purpose. Jessica joined them in the center of the arena, unveiling a sign for the new youth center that would house the program. Hope Ranch is honored to establish the Emily Patterson Jr. Rehabilitation Program, she announced, and equally honored that Henry Carter has agreed to serve as its first director, sharing his wisdom and experience with the next generation. The crowd applauded as Emily hugged Henry impulsively, her arms wrapping around his waist. See, she whispered, I told you you'd need to stick around for a long time. You have too much to teach us. After the ceremony, as the attendees enjoyed refreshments in the newly dedicated youth center, Rachel found her uncle sitting quietly on a bench outside, Storm grazing contentedly nearby. Quite a legacy you've built here, she observed, sitting beside him. The Carter Protocol being used nationwide, vet schools updating their curricula, and now this youth program. Not bad for a man who once thought his useful days were over. Henry watched Storm with evident satisfaction. Never about legacy, he said. Just about doing right by each animal that comes through those doors. The rest followed naturally. Rachel knew better than to argue, but she also knew the truth. The stubborn determination that had driven Henry to fight for Storm when everyone else had given up had transformed veterinary medicine's approach to catastrophic injuries. Hundreds of animals that would have been euthanized in the past were now being given chances at recovery. The ripple effects of one man's refusal to accept defeat continued to spread outward, touching countless lives, both animal and human. As the setting sun cast long shadows across Hope Ranch, visitors departed and the day's activities wound down. Henry made his final rounds of the therapy barn, checking on each patient, ensuring comfort measures were in place for the night. In Liberty's stall, he spent extra time, sitting on a hay bale while the injured mare grew accustomed to his presence. You're wondering if it's worth the fight, he told her quietly. I can see it in your eyes, same look Storm had in the beginning. Pain makes you doubt, makes you wonder if it wouldn't be easier to give up. He stroked her neck gently. But there's something else there too. I see the fighter in you, same as I saw in him. From the doorway, Jessica watched silently. She had seen this routine countless times. Henry's almost mystical ability to connect with injured animals, to somehow communicate his unwavering belief in their capacity to heal. He's doing his magic again, she murmured to Dr. Winters, who had joined her. The veterinarian nodded. We've tried to quantify it for the research papers, this aspect of the Carter Protocol. But how do you measure the impact of someone who simply refuses to give up on you? Science doesn't have instruments for that kind of faith. Later that evening, in the quiet of his cottage, Henry reviewed the therapy plans for the 3 current patients while Storm dozed outside his window in the private paddock Jessica had created for him years ago. On his walls hung framed photographs documenting their journey, Storm's first supported steps in the lake, the triumphant ride with Emily on the 1-year anniversary, the 2 of them visiting a children's hospital in Houston where a local news station had captured the moment a young patient took her first steps since an accident, inspired by their story. A gentle knock at the door preceded Rachel's entrance, carrying 2 mugs of tea. You should be resting, she chided gently. Big day tomorrow with the new veterinary residents arriving. Henry accepted the tea gratefully. Just finishing up these notes, he assured her. Want to make sure Liberty's protocol acknowledges her anxiety. She's more frightened than Storm was. Needs extra reassurance. Rachel sat across from him, studying her uncle's face in the warm lamplight. The years had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but they were the lines of a life fully lived, of challenges met and overcome. I was thinking today about that meeting, she said. The one where you refused to let them euthanize Storm. Do you remember what you said? Henry smiled faintly. Said a lot of things. Was pretty worked up. You said, if you do this, you're killing more than this horse. You're killing everything this place stands for. Rachel shook her head wonderingly. You couldn't have known then how prophetic those words would be. How saving Storm would transform not just Hope Ranch, but equine rehabilitation across the country. Just knew it wasn't right to give up without trying everything. Henry replied with characteristic simplicity. Rest followed naturally. As twilight deepened into night, the sounds of Hope Ranch settled into peaceful quiet. Horses shifting in their stalls, night staff making final rounds, the distant call of an owl from the old oak tree behind the therapy barn. In his paddock, Storm raised his head at the familiar tap of Henry's cane against the cottage floor, a sound he had learned to recognize above all others. Inside, Henry Carter, once told he would never walk or speak clearly again after his stroke, stood by the window looking out at the ranch that had become the epicenter of a revolution in veterinary medicine. The journey had begun with one injured horse and one stubborn old man, both written off as beyond help. It had grown into something neither medical science nor conventional wisdom could have predicted, a testament to the power of refusing to accept limitations imposed by others. Good night, old friend, Henry murmured toward Storm's shadowy form in the darkness. Rest well. More work to do tomorrow. And across Hope Ranch, in recovery stalls and therapy paddocks, horses that would once have been considered lost causes rested peacefully, their futures rewritten by the legacy of Willow Creek, where a horse and an old man had taught the world that sometimes the most powerful medicine of all is simply refusing to give up.